Arthur Pendleton stared out the frost-covered window of his dilapidated farmhouse, watching another winter sunset fade over the Vermont hills. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since morning, and the radio warned of an unseasonable blizzard approaching. Not that he needed the warning. His knees had been aching all day, a more reliable weather predictor than any meteorologist. The kitchen table before him was buried under a familiar landscape of past due notices, bank statements with alarming negative balances, and scribbled calculations that never seemed to add up in his favor. The latest letter from the bank sat on top of the pile, its message unmistakably final. 3 months of missed mortgage payments, foreclosure procedures beginning. Not like there's a line of buyers for a broken-down beef farm anyway, he muttered to himself, crumpling the letter and tossing it toward the wastebasket. It missed, joining several similar balls of paper on the worn wooden floor. The honey business had been struggling for years, but this season had been catastrophic. His jars of Vermont wildflower honey sat unsold at the farmer's market, passed over for the flashier packaging of corporate brands or the trendier apiaries with their flavored honeys and clever marketing. Arthur's weathered wooden sign and plain glass jars seemed outdated, like him. At 57, Arthur Pendleton was a quiet fixture in the rural community, present but rarely noticed, like a faded painting hanging too long on a wall. 15 years since his divorce, 5 years since his daughter stopped calling regularly from college in California. Now she just sent occasional texts on holidays, her life too busy for more. He didn't blame her. He watched as one of his tools, a small wrench he'd left on the counter, seemed to slide slightly to the left on its own. Arthur blinked and looked again. Had it moved? Or was his mind playing tricks again? This happened often enough that he barely registered it anymore. Tools relocated overnight. The radio occasionally emitting strange static patterns that sounded almost like whispers. The squirrels on his property watching him with eyes that seemed too knowing. Just getting old, he muttered, rubbing his eyes and turning up the ancient radio as it crackled with the evening forecast. Extreme weather system moving and faster than predicted. Residents of Washington, Addison, and Rutland counties should prepare for up to 20 inches of snow overnight, with temperatures dropping to record lows for October. This unseasonable blizzard has meteorologists puzzled. Arthur switched it off with a sigh and moved to the wood stove, adding another log. The house needed more insulation. The roof needed patching. The barn needed new supports. The list of repairs was endless and impossible. But the bees he could protect. He pulled on his worn canvas jacket, thick gloves, and a wool hat. Outside, the first fat snowflakes were already falling, dancing in the beam of his flashlight as he trudged toward the apiary at the edge of his 5-acre property. The wind was picking up, carrying crystalline ice that stung his cheeks. Arthur had 22 hives arranged in 3 neat rows, each painted white, though the paint was peeling badly now. They were wrapped in black tar paper for insulation, but he worried it wouldn't be enough for the brutal cold coming. The colonies had already begun clustering inside their hives for winter, forming their living sphere around the queen, vibrating their wing muscles to generate heat. They would take turns rotating from the cold exterior to the warm center, a democratic system of survival. Arthur had always admired their cooperative nature, their silent purpose. He checked each hive methodically, securing loose coverings, brushing accumulating snow from the tops. He'd lost 3 colonies last winter to cold and moisture. He couldn't afford to lose more. As he worked his way down the final row, the snow now falling in blinding sheets, he heard something distinctly unusual, a high-pitched sound between a chirp and a whine, definitely not from any creature native to Vermont. Arthur paused, his flashlight beam cutting through the white curtain of snowfall. There was again a distressed, alien sound. Following the noise, Arthur moved beyond his property line to the edge of the wooded area. The beam of his flashlight caught something reflecting back, a small, half-buried lump in the snow. As he approached, the lump moved slightly, emitting that strange chirp again. Arthur knelt and brushed away the snow, revealing a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was about the size of a kitten, but definitely not a mammal. Its body was covered in fine scales that shifted color slightly as it moved. a deep blue-green that seemed almost iridescent despite its obvious distress. It had a long, thin neck, a triangular head with delicate ridges, and what appeared to be small, folded appendages on its back that might have been vestigial wings. Its most striking feature, however, was a subtle glow emanating from beneath its scales, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, radiating a surprising amount of warmth. Arthur's first instinct was to recoil. This wasn't a lost pet or wildlife. This was something else. But when the creature looked up at him with large, intelligent eyes and made another pitiful sound, something in Arthur's chest tightened. "You're freezing out here, aren't you?" he said, his voice soft in the howling wind. "Whatever you are." The creature chirped again, a tremor running through its small body. It tried to move, but collapsed back into the snow, clearly exhausted and cold. Despite everything in Arthur's practical mind telling him to leave the strange being alone, he found himself removing a glove and reaching out slowly. The creature didn't flinch when his fingers made contact with its scales, which felt smooth and warm despite the freezing temperature. "Well, I can't just leave you out here die," Arthur decided, carefully scooping the creature into his hands. It weighed almost nothing, and as soon as it was lifted from the snow, it curled into his palm, seeking warmth. As Arthur turned back toward his farmhouse, the blizzard hit full force, walls of white obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He tucked the creature inside his jacket, feeling its warmth against his chest as he battled his way back home. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Arthur placed the creature gently on a folded towel near the wood stove. In the yellow lamplight, it looked even more extraordinary. Its scales shifted subtly between deep blue and emerald green, and that inner glow pulsed more regularly now that it was warming up. It watched Arthur with unnerving intelligence as he moved around the kitchen. "What do you eat?" Arthur wondered aloud, opening his nearly empty refrigerator. "Assuming you eat it all." He tried a small saucer of milk first, which the creature sniffed but showed no interest in. A piece of bread received the same treatment. When Arthur placed a spoonful of his dwindling honey supply near it, however, the creature's demeanor changed instantly. It chirped excitedly and extended a thin, slightly forked tongue, lapping at the golden liquid with evident delight. As the creature ate, the lights in the kitchen flickered dramatically. Not the usual momentary dimming that came with the old wiring, but a patterned sequence almost like Morse code. Arthur glanced up at the ceiling fixture with a frown. The radio on the counter suddenly switched on by itself, emitting a burst of static that made the creature freeze, its head tilting as though listening. "That's odd," Arthur murmured, moving to switch the radio off. Before he could reach it, the static organized itself momentarily into something that sounded almost like words, too distorted to understand, but definitely not random noise. The creature chirped back at the radio, a complex series of sounds. Arthur stood very still, looking between the strange being and his radio. "You're responding to that, aren't you?" The lights flickered again, and the creature resumed eating its honey, though its eyes remained fixed on Arthur with an unreadable expression. The house creaked and moaned under the assault of the blizzard outside, snow already piling against the windows. Arthur built up the fire in the wood stove, his mind racing with questions he had no framework to answer. He was a practical man, a former mechanic turned beekeeper, not someone who believed in the fantastic or unexplainable. Yet he couldn't deny the evidence before his eyes. As the night deepened and the storm howled, Arthur dozed in his armchair, waking occasionally to check on his unusual guest. Around midnight, he was startled fully awake by a sharp tapping at the back door. Grabbing his flashlight, Arthur cautiously approached the door. Nothing should be out in this weather. He shined the light through the window and saw only swirling snow. The tapping came again, more insistent. Opening the door a crack unleashed a blast of frigid air and snow. At first, he saw nothing. Then his light caught the same iridescent reflection he'd seen earlier. Not one, but two more creatures, identical to the first, huddled against the door frame, their bodies partially buried in the snow that had drifted against the house. They were drawn up against the woodpile, clearly attracted to the heat from the stove that radiated through the wall. "There are more of you?" Arthur said incredulously. The creatures chirped weakly, their glow much fainter than the first ones had been. Without really thinking about it, Arthur opened the door wider and beckoned them inside. They didn't need a second invitation, scurrying across the threshold in a blur of movement. Arthur found himself in his kitchen with 3 otherworldly creatures, all now converging on the first one he'd rescued. They huddled together near the stove, chirping in what sounded like communication, their scales changing colors slightly as they interacted, ripples of blue, green, and occasionally flashes of gold. "I should probably be calling someone about this," Arthur said, though he made no move toward his phone. Who would he even call? Animal control? The university? The military? None of those options seemed right, especially as he watched the creatures groom each other with obvious relief at being reunited. He noticed now that each creature wore a thin band of silvery metal around one ankle. Not like a wild animal tag or tracking device, but something far more sophisticated, with minute engravings and what looked like tiny embedded lights. These bands occasionally emitted almost imperceptible pulses of light in patterns. "You're someone's something," Arthur said softly. "But whose? And what are you doing in Vermont during a blizzard?" The creatures ignored his questions, focused entirely on each other and the honey he'd provided. Arthur found himself making a nest for them from old towels near the stove, then offering more honey, which they consumed eagerly. Despite all rational thought telling him this situation was dangerous, impossible, and completely beyond his understanding, he felt a strange sense of purpose. For years, Arthur had been merely existing, going through the motions of life, tending his bees, selling what honey he could, watching his farm slowly decay around him. Now, suddenly, here was something extraordinary happening under his roof. It was terrifying, yes, but also invigorating. As he watched the creatures curl up together in the makeshift nest, their bodies emitting that gentle warmth and light, Arthur felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: wonder. Morning brought no relief from the blizzard. If anything, it had intensified overnight, with wind howling through every crack in the old farmhouse. Arthur woke stiff from sleeping in his chair, blinking in confusion at the empty nest of towels before remembering his strange visitors. A momentary panic gripped him until he spotted movement on the kitchen counter. All 3 creatures were gathered around the honey jar he'd left open, chirping happily as they took turns dipping their forked tongues into the sweet substance. In daylight, they looked even more remarkable, their scales gleaming with complex patterns that seemed to shift and change, their movements quick and precise. When they noticed Arthur watching, they all turned simultaneously, regarding him with identical tilts of their heads. "Good morning to you too," Arthur said, feeling oddly self-conscious. "I've got a lot of questions for you 3, but I'm guessing you can't answer them, can you?" In response, one of the creatures, the first one he'd found, he thought, though they were nearly identical, emitted a small spark from its mouth, like a tiny, harmless firework. Arthur jumped back in surprise, but the creature just repeated the action, accompanied by a satisfied chirp. "Well, that's interesting," Arthur said, cautiously approaching. "I think I'll call you Sparks. All of you, I guess, unless you object." None of the creatures showed any sign of objection. If anything, they seemed pleased, chirping in unison and flicking their tails. Up close, Arthur could see other details he'd missed the night before. Their eyes had slit pupils that expanded and contracted like a cat's, and what he'd thought might be vestigial wings were actually delicate, translucent membranes that occasionally extended slightly before folding back against their bodies. Arthur's day took on a surreal quality as he attempted to maintain some semblance of routine while housing 3 impossible beings. He checked his phone. No service, as was common during bad storms in his rural location. The power flickered on and off throughout the morning and finally died completely around noon, leaving the wood stove as their only source of heat. The Sparks, as he now thought of them, seemed fascinated by everything in the house. They explored cautiously, climbing shelves, examining objects, and occasionally making those strange crackling sparks when excited. They showed particular interest in anything electrical, the dead radio, the light bulbs, the wiring. Their intelligence was undeniable. Arthur watched in amazement as they figured out how to open cupboard doors by working together, and when one accidentally knocked over a glass, the others quickly helped clean up the spilled water by pushing towels with their heads and feet. That afternoon, Arthur discovered something else extraordinary. Despite the blizzard raging outside, his bees were active, not merely surviving, but seemingly thriving. When he trudged out to check on them, bundled against the cold, he found the snow melted in perfect circles around each hive, and the air around them humming with activity that should have been impossible in these temperatures. When he returned to the house, the sparks were waiting by the door, chirping excitedly. They seemed to know where he'd been, and one even imitated a buzzing sound, clearly meant to mimic his bees. "You have something to do with this, don't you?" Arthur asked, brushing snow from his coat. "What are you doing to my bees?" The sparks offered no explanation, but later that day, Arthur found them clustered at the kitchen window that faced the apiary, chirping in complex patterns as the bees outside swarmed in equally complex formations, defying the storm. That night, as Arthur prepared for bed by layering every blanket he owned to compensate for the lack of heat, he discovered the sparks had another surprising ability. When gathered together in his bedroom, they increased their internal glow until they were emitting enough light and heat to warm the entire room comfortably. They arranged themselves on his dresser, watching him with those intelligent eyes until he fell asleep. Arthur dreamed of vast star fields and strange geometries, of humming frequencies that seemed just beyond his comprehension. He woke to find frost patterns on his bedroom windows, not the usual random crystalline formations, but precise geometric designs that reminded him of circuit boards or star charts. The sparks were already awake, tracing these patterns with their tiny clawed feet, chirping in what sounded almost like admiration. When Arthur went to the kitchen, he found more of their handiwork. They had somehow managed to spill flour from a canister and had drawn intricate patterns in it across the counter and floor. The designs were too precise, too intentional to be random. They reminded him of the crop circles he'd seen in newspapers or ancient astronomical diagrams. As the day progressed, Arthur's sense of wonder gradually shifted toward concern. The sparks had nearly depleted his entire honey supply. 3 years' worth of personal reserves gone in less than 2 days. With the power out and phone lines down, he had no way to call for help or advice. Not that he knew who to call anyway. Midday, a brief lull in the storm allowed him to make his way to his nearest neighbor, Harold Winters, an elderly man who lived about a mile down the road and was known locally as something of an eccentric. Harold had been a professional astronomer before retirement and now spent his time with a collection of powerful telescopes, documenting what he called anomalies in the night sky. Arthur had always considered Harold harmless, but slightly paranoid. Now, trudging through thigh-deep snow to reach the man's modest house, he wondered if Harold's eccentricities might actually be valuable. "Arthur," surprised to see anyone out in this weather, Harold greeted him, ushering him inside a cluttered living room dominated by maps, charts, and a large telescope pointed out a specially designed window. "Power's out all over the county," they're saying. "Harold, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Before the storm, maybe?" Arthur asked, carefully removing his snow-covered boots. Harold's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Unusual? Like what kind of unusual are we talking about?" "I don't know. Lights in the sky? Strange weather patterns? Anything out of the ordinary?" Harold studied him for a long moment, then walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. "Thursday night, before the storm hit, I recorded several anomalous light formations moving in precise geometric patterns. Not aircraft, at least not any aircraft I've ever documented. They preceded the storm front by approximately 3 hours." He spread several photographs on the table. They showed blurry but distinct light formations against the night sky, arranged in triangular and hexagonal patterns. Most people would call it atmospheric electrical phenomena, ST. Elmo's fire, ball lightning, that sort of thing, Errol continued. But the precision of the movements, I've never seen anything natural behave that way. Arthur stared at the photos, his mouth dry. And right after this, the blizzard hit. This unseasonable blizzard that no one predicted until it was already on top of us. Precisely, Harold nodded. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. Meteorologically impossible, yet here we are. He peered at Arthur. Why are you asking? Have you seen something? Arthur hesitated. He'd known Harold for 15 years, but had never had more than passing conversations with him. Could he trust the man with what was happening at his farm? Just curious, Arthur finally said. This storm seems wrong somehow. Harold looked disappointed, but didn't press. Well, if you notice anything unusual, Arthur, anything at all, I'm documenting everything. The truth deserves to be recorded, even if no one believes it. I'll keep that in mind, Arthur promised, already preparing to leave. He needed to get back to the Sparks. By the time Arthur returned home, the storm had intensified again. He found the Sparks huddled together in the kitchen, their glow dimmer than before. They perked up at the sight of him, chirping weakly. The empty honey jar lay on its side near them. You're still hungry, aren't you? Arthur realized, feeling a pang of concern. He checked his cupboards again, finding only a tiny bit of sugar and some molasses. He mixed these with water and offered the solution to the Sparks, who consumed it eagerly but without the same enthusiasm they'd shown for honey. That night, Arthur noticed the metal bands around the Sparks' ankles were pulsing more frequently, sometimes in synchronization, sometimes in complex sequences. The creatures seemed increasingly agitated, staring out the windows at the storm-darkened sky, then back at Arthur with what he could only interpret as concern. In the morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape buried under nearly 3 feet of snow. The sun shone brilliantly on the pristine white expanse, almost blindingly bright. Arthur opened the front door to begin the arduous process of digging out, the Sparks watching curiously from inside. He had barely cleared the front steps when an earth-shaking rumble filled the air, not thunder, but a deep, mechanical drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Sparks inside the house began chirping frantically. Arthur looked up. The clear blue sky was disappearing, eclipsed by what at first looked like storm clouds gathering with impossible speed. But these weren't clouds. As his eyes adjusted to the glare, Arthur could make out distinct shapes, thousands upon thousands of identical, angular objects hovering in precise formation. They were a dark, burnished metal, each about the size of a commercial aircraft but shaped like arrowheads, with pulsing lights along their undersides that matched the rhythm he'd seen on the Sparks' ankle bands. Ships. Thousands of ships, blotting out the sun. Arthur stood frozen, shovel in hand, as the massive fleet positioned itself above his small farm. The rational part of his brain shut down entirely. There was no frame of reference for this, no way to process what he was seeing. A single beam of intense light shot down from the nearest ship, striking the ground about 20 feet from where Arthur stood. The snow in its path instantly vaporized, revealing bare earth beneath. Within the column of light, a figure began to materialize, humanoid but definitely not human. The being that solidified before Arthur stood about 7 feet tall, with a body structure reminiscent of an insect, but covered in what appeared to be a combination of exoskeleton and metallic armor. Its head featured multiple compound eyes arranged around a central sensory cluster, and where a mouth should be, there was instead a complex apparatus that moved slightly as the being regarded him. Arthur gripped his shovel tighter, though he knew it was useless. The Sparks had emerged from the house behind him, their chirping now low and continuous, almost like a warning. The tall being raised what might have been an arm, revealing a device that projected a 3-dimensional image between them, a rotating hologram showing the 3 Sparks. A series of sharp, clicking sounds emerged from the being, followed by a mechanical voice that seemed to come from the device rather than the creature itself. Return biological specimens ST-7, ST-9, and ST-12. Unauthorized possession of Alliance military property is a violation carrying extreme penalties. Arthur stared, his mind struggling to catch up. Military property? They're alive. They're intelligent beings. The mechanical translation continued as though he hadn't spoken. These prototypes represent significant strategic investment. Final warning: surrender specimens immediately. Behind Arthur, the Sparks had moved closer, now positioned at his feet. Their chirping had changed in tone, no longer fearful, but almost defiant. He looked down at them, saw the way they positioned themselves protectively near him rather than trying to flee, and made his decision. "No," Arthur said, straightening to his full height, which still left him dwarfed by the alien commander. "They came to me for help. They were freezing, abandoned in the snow. If they're yours, you left them to die." The alien commander's sensory apparatus flickered with light patterns. Specimens were not abandoned. They escaped during atmospheric testing procedures. They are property, not sentient beings, merely biological mechanisms created to serve specific military functions. "They don't seem like mechanisms to me," Arthur countered, his fear giving way to indignation. "They communicate. They solve problems. They help each other. Whatever they were created for, they become something more." The commander made a sharp gesture, and the air around them hummed with energy. Above, several of the ships began to descend slightly, positioning weapon systems that made Arthur's blood run cold. Enormous cannon-like structures that pulsed with the same energy he'd seen in the Sparks, but magnified 1,000-fold. "Final opportunity for compliance," the commander stated, the mechanical voice somehow conveying menace despite its flatness. "Surrender specimens or face immediate neutralization." Arthur should have been terrified beyond reason. He should have complied immediately, handed over the Sparks, retreated into his house, and counted himself lucky to survive the encounter. Instead, he felt a surge of protective fury that surprised even himself. "They stay with me," he declared, one hand moving down to touch the nearest Spark gently. "I don't know what they are or where they came from, but they chose to come to me. That means something." The alien commander stepped back, raising a device that Arthur assumed was a weapon. The ships above emitted a high-pitched whine as their weapon systems powered up, targeting not just Arthur, but his entire property. This was it then. After years of quiet desperation, of watching his life and livelihood slowly crumble, Arthur Pendleton would meet his end defending 3 small creatures he barely understood against an alien armada. Somehow it felt right, the first truly meaningful choice he'd made in years. The Sparks, however, had other ideas. As the commander prepared to give the order to fire, all 3 creatures suddenly raised themselves up on their hind legs, their bodies glowing with increasing intensity. The metal bands around their ankles pulsed in perfect synchronization, sending out waves of energy that Arthur could actually see distorting the air around them. At the same moment, an extraordinary sound filled the air, a deep, resonant humming that Arthur recognized instantly. His bees, thousands upon thousands of them, were emerging from their hives despite the snow and cold. They rose in a great, coordinated swarm that blotted out the morning sun, their flight pattern matching exactly the geometric designs the Sparks had drawn in flour on his kitchen floor. The alien commander took a step back, the compound eyes fixing on the approaching swarm with what looked like alarm. The device in its hand wavered. The Sparks began to emit not just light, but actual electricity now, crackling arcs of blue-white energy that connected between them, forming a triangle with Arthur at its center. The bees swirled around them, their collective buzzing rising in pitch until it matched perfectly the frequency of the Sparks' energy field. Arthur felt a strange vibration pass through his body, not painful, but intense, as though every atom of his being was suddenly resonating with some fundamental frequency of the universe. The snow around him began to melt in expanding circles, revealing patterns in the earth beneath that matched the frost patterns on his windows, circuit-like designs that now glowed with the same energy the Sparks were emitting. The alien commander was backing away now, its communication device emitting frantic clicks and whirs. Above, the massive fleet of ships seemed to waver, as though seen through heat distortion, their weapons systems flickering erratically. Then, with a sound like 1,000 crystal glasses shattering at once, a massive pulse of energy erupted from the triangular formation of sparks. It expanded outward in concentric rings, passing harmlessly through Arthur, but engulfing the commander and rising to encompass the entire fleet above. For one breathless moment, everything seemed frozen in this energy field. The commander, the ships, even a swarm of bees suspended in mid-flight. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the energy pulse collapsed back inward, carrying with it the entire alien presence. The commander simply vanished, there one moment and gone the next. Above, the massive fleet of ships seemed to fold somehow, each vessel collapsing in on itself like paper crumpling, until they too disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a faint distortion in the air that quickly faded. The sky was empty once more, brilliantly blue and unmarred by clouds or ships or anything else unnatural. The bees, their purpose apparently fulfilled, began to disperse, returning to their hives in orderly streams. The sparks slumped to the ground, their glow dimmed to almost nothing, clearly exhausted by whatever they had just accomplished. Arthur stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. Had the aliens been destroyed? Transported elsewhere? He had no way of knowing. All he knew was that the threat was gone, and he and the sparks had somehow survived. Carefully, he gathered the 3 small creatures in his arms and carried them back into the house. They were warm but listless, their scales dulled to a matte gray. He placed them gently in their nest of towels near the wood stove and added more wood to build up the heat, worried by their weakened state. Hours passed, with Arthur keeping vigil beside the sparks. Outside, the world returned to normal, or what passed for normal after an unprecedented blizzard. He could hear distant snowplows, the occasional vehicle navigating the freshly cleared roads. Power remained out, but his old rotary phone began working again, though Arthur couldn't imagine who he would call or what he would say. As evening approached, the sparks finally began to stir, their scales gradually regaining some of their iridescent color. One by one, they raised their heads, chirping weakly but with clear recognition when they saw Arthur. "You saved us all," Arthur said quietly, offering them water with a bit of his remaining sugar dissolved in it. "Though I'm not entirely sure how." The sparks drank eagerly, their strength visibly returning. As they recovered, the metal bands around their ankles began to pulse again, but differently now, steadier, calmer, with occasional bursts of light that seemed directed specifically at Arthur. He had the strangest feeling they were trying to communicate with him directly. "I still don't understand who or what you are," Arthur continued, watching them closely. "Were you really created as weapons? Is that what they wanted you for?" The sparks exchanged glances. There was no other way to describe it. And then the largest one, the first he'd found, approached Arthur and placed a tiny clawed foot on his hand. Instantly, a series of images flooded his mind. Sterile laboratories, rows of transparent containers filled with developing creatures, harsh training regimens, tests involving the creature's ability to generate and direct energy, failed specimens discarded, successful ones fitted with control bands and subjected to increasingly demanding trials. Arthur gasped and pulled his hand away, blinking rapidly. You show me that? You can share memories?" The spark chirped affirmatively, then cautiously reached for his hand again. This time, Arthur forced himself to remain still as more images came. The sparks, slightly smaller and clearly younger, housed together in a secure facility. A planned weapons test in Earth's upper atmosphere. The 3 of them, working in concert, using the control bands that were meant to restrain them to instead create a momentary disruption in their containment field. Their escape, falling through Earth's atmosphere, the cold nearly killing them until they sensed something, the unique electromagnetic signature of Arthur's bee colony, somehow resonating at a frequency that attracted them. Arthur saw himself through the spark's eyes, a solitary figure trudging through snow, surrounded by a faint aura they could perceive, but he couldn't, some innate quality that had drawn them to him specifically. "You chose me," Arthur whispered as the connection faded. You could have gone anywhere, but you chose my farm. What? The sparks simply chirped, looking at him with those intelligent eyes, and Arthur somehow understood that they didn't fully know themselves. It had been instinct, a resonance, a feeling that here was sanctuary. In the days that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Power was restored to the county, roads were cleared, and Arthur's neighbors began the process of recovering from the blizzard. News reports mentioned unusual atmospheric phenomena during the storm, with some meteorologists theorizing about rare forms of lightning or stratospheric temperature inversions. Harold Winters called twice, excited about anomalous electromagnetic readings his equipment had recorded the morning after the storm, but Arthur deflected his questions. Some truths weren't ready to be shared. The sparks remained with Arthur, gradually growing stronger. They no longer needed to hide. With the alien force apparently gone, there was no immediate threat, but they seemed content to stay within the boundaries of his farm, developing a particular affinity for the bee yard. Arthur watched in amazement as they began to influence his hives in ways he couldn't have imagined. Under their attention, the bees produced honey at 3 times their normal rate, even in winter. More remarkably, the honey itself had changed, deeper in color, with subtle iridescence that matched the spark scales, and possessing properties that Arthur discovered accidentally when he healed a deep cut on his hand overnight. The sparks themselves were growing, not just in strength, but in actual size. Their vestigial wing membranes were expanding, and occasionally they would glide short distances, clearly practicing. They spent hours each day with the bees, chirping in patterns that the swarms seemed to understand and respond to. 1 month after the blizzard, Arthur paid off his overdue mortgage with money from selling his new specialty honey, which was commanding premium prices at farmers markets across the state. Customers claimed it helped with everything from insomnia to arthritis, and demand was quickly outstripping his supply. The farmhouse was gradually being repaired. A new roof first, then proper insulation, then the structural issues in the barn. Arthur worked with renewed purpose and energy, often finding himself humming as he worked. The sparks helped in their own ways, using their abilities to locate electrical problems, predict weather patterns that might affect the bees, and occasionally sharing more fragments of knowledge through their touch telepathy. Arthur never told anyone about them. When neighbors commented on his sudden change in fortune or the unusual properties of his honey, he simply smiled and mentioned a new approach to beekeeping. The sparks remained well hidden whenever visitors came, though Arthur suspected they were always watching, always learning. On a clear spring night, nearly 6 months after finding the first spark in the snow, Arthur sat on his newly repaired porch, watching the stars emerge above his flourishing farm. The sparks lounged nearby, their bodies now the size of small dogs, their scales glimmering in the moonlight. The ankle bands they wore had changed as well, the pulsing lights now harmonized into a steady, comfortable rhythm. "Do you ever miss your home?" Arthur asked, not entirely sure if they understood his spoken words or merely sensed his intent. Whatever home might mean for you. The largest spark, the first one, whom he still thought of as the leader, looked up at the star-filled sky, then back at Arthur, making a soft chirping sound that somehow conveyed contentment. It moved closer, placing a clawed foot on his hand, sharing a brief but vivid image. The farm, the bees, Arthur himself, all surrounded by that mysterious aura the sparks could perceive. Home! Arthur smiled, a lump forming in his throat. In the months that followed, Arthur's life continued its unexpected transformation. The sparks grew stronger and more agile, now capable of short flights that delighted them immensely. They spent hours soaring between the trees at the edge of his property, their scales flashing like living gemstones in the sunlight. The bee colonies flourished in ways that defied conventional apiculture. They remained active year-round, producing honey with increasingly remarkable properties. Local doctors have begun quietly recommending Arthur's honey to patients with chronic conditions, and a research team from the university had reached out about studying its unique enzymatic properties, though Arthur politely declined. His financial situation had reversed completely. The specialty honey commanded premium prices, selling out within hours at farmers markets. Arthur had paid off all his debts and was reinvesting in the farm, adding new hives and upgrading equipment. He remained cautious about expansion, however, instinctively understanding that the harmony between the sparks and his bees was a delicate ecosystem that shouldn't be exploited. Harold Winters had become something of a regular visitor, though Arthur always ensured the sparks remained hidden during his calls. The elderly astronomer continued tracking what he called atmospheric anomalies above Arthur's property, convinced that something significant had occurred during the blizzard. The electromagnetic signatures over your farm are unlike anything I've recorded elsewhere, Harold explained one afternoon as they shared coffee on Arthur's porch. And did you notice? No military or government inquiries about the mass aerial event thousands of witnesses reported. It's being dismissed as a weather phenomenon, but we both know better, don't we? Arthur merely nodded noncommittally, watching a formation of bees create perfect geometric patterns as they traveled between hives. The patterns matched designs the sparks had taught them, efficient flight paths that conserved energy and strengthened their collective communication. Your bees are different too, Harold observed shrewdly. Everyone's talking about it. Some folks at the market are calling your honey miracle honey, you know. Arthur shrugged. I've just found methods that work well for them. Nothing magical about it. Harold gave him a knowing look but didn't press further. Their friendship had developed around this careful dance. Harold's pointed observations, Arthur's gentle deflections. Both men understood more than they acknowledged aloud. One evening in late summer, as Arthur sat in the garden watching the sunset with the sparks lounging nearby, the largest one suddenly sat upright, its scales shifting to a deep indigo color Arthur had learned indicated alertness or concern. The other two quickly adopted the same posture, all three staring intently at the darkening sky. What is it? Arthur asked, instantly alert himself. Are they coming back? The leader spark approached and placed a clawed foot on Arthur's hand, sharing a brief vision. Not the armada returning, but a small scout vessel, nearly undetectable, watching from high orbit. The spark conveyed not immediate danger, but a sense of vigilance. They had not been forgotten by whatever military force had created them. How long have you known this? Arthur asked, troubled that they had kept this information from him. The spark shared another image. The scout had been there almost since the beginning, appearing shortly after the armada's disappearance, maintaining distance but never leaving. The sparks had been monitoring it, using their growing abilities to ensure it couldn't report their exact location or status. That night, Arthur lay awake thinking about implications of this revelation. The sparks were weapons, created for purposes he still didn't fully understand. The force that made them clearly hadn't abandoned the search. What would happen when the sparks reached their full maturity, whatever that might be? What would happen if their creators sent something more than a distant scout? Morning brought a surprise visitor. As Arthur was inspecting the hives, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled into his driveway. A tall woman in a crisp suit emerged, her demeanor professional but not threatening. The sparks, sensing potential danger, had already hidden themselves in their favorite spot beneath the barn's foundation. Mr. Pendleton, the woman approached, extending a hand. I'm Dr. Eleanor Vega, Department of Agricultural Research. May I have a moment of your time? Arthur shook her hand cautiously. What can I help you with, Dr. Vega? We've been monitoring unusual agricultural outputs in this region, she explained, glancing around the property with practiced casualness. Your honey production has drawn particular attention. Exceptional yields despite adverse climate conditions. Unusual molecular properties in the final product. We're interested in studying your methods. Arthur maintained a neutral expression, though his heart raced. Nothing special about my methods. Just traditional beekeeping with some modern efficiency improvements. Dr. Vega smiled thinly. Mr. Pendleton, your honey contains compounds we've never encountered in nature. Compounds with significant medical applications. This isn't about agricultural oversight. This is about national interest. I appreciate the government's interest in my little operation, Arthur replied carefully, but I'm not looking to partner with any research institutions at the moment. My methods are proprietary. Dr. Vega's smile disappeared. 6 months ago, during the unseasonable blizzard, multiple radar installations detected unidentified aerial phenomena over this exact property. Subsequently, your failing farm suddenly produces honey with molecular structures that defy conventional analysis. Surely you understand why this has raised questions. A chill ran through Arthur. They had been watching, connecting dots. Sounds like quite the conspiracy theory, Dr. Vega. But all I know is beekeeping. She handed him a business card. We'll be in touch, Mr. Pendleton. I strongly suggest you consider cooperation. Some matters extend beyond individual choice. As she drove away, Arthur felt the sparks emerge from hiding, gathering around his feet with concerned chirps. The leader touched his hand, sharing a vision of Dr. Vega in a secure facility, reviewing satellite imagery of his farm, surrounded by others in both military and scientific attire. I know, Arthur sighed. They won't stop with one visit. That night, Arthur sat at his kitchen table with the Sparks, facing a decision. The ankle bands on the Sparks pulsed with complex patterns as they communicated among themselves. Finally, the leader approached and placed both front feet on Arthur's hands. The vision that flowed into his mind was expansive and detailed. A small ship, hidden beneath the pond on Arthur's property, placed there by the Sparks during the confrontation with the Armada. It had been part of their escape plan, a vessel designed for their unique biology, capable of interstellar travel but dormant until needed. They had been repairing and preparing it slowly, drawing energy from the Earth's electromagnetic field. It was nearly ready. The message was clear. They could leave, escape before either the human government or their creators closed in. The Sparks could return to space, seek sanctuary elsewhere in the vastness of the galaxy. But the vision continued, showing Arthur accompanying them, leaving Earth behind, embarking on a journey beyond imagination. The Sparks wanted him to come with them. Arthur withdrew his hands, overwhelmed. You want me to leave? Leave everything. He gestured around the kitchen, the farm beyond. This is my home. I've spent my life here. The Sparks chirped softly, understanding but insistent. The leader shared one final image. Dr. Vega's team returning, this time with equipment, containment vehicles, armed personnel. The message couldn't be clearer. Remaining meant capture for both Arthur and the Sparks. For 3 days, Arthur wrestled with the decision while continuing his daily routines. He visited town, sold honey at the market, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors who had no idea of the choice weighing on him. He called his daughter in California, listening to her chat about her job and boyfriend, unable to tell her he was considering leaving the planet. On the 4th day, he spotted another black SUV driving slowly past his property. That evening, Harold called to warn him that men in suits had been asking questions about Arthur in town. Time was running out. Under the cover of night, Arthur filled a backpack with essentials, photographs, his grandfather's watch, a jar of the special honey. The Sparks led him to the pond, their bodies glowing brightly enough to light the path. At the water's edge, the leader touched the surface with one foot. The pond didn't drain. Rather, the water parted like liquid mercury, revealing a sleek vessel beneath that looked nothing like the angular military ships of the Armada. This craft was organic in design, its surface rippling with colors similar to the Spark scales. A doorway dilated open in its side, revealing a surprisingly spacious interior. Arthur hesitated at the threshold, looking back at his farmhouse silhouetted against the starry sky. 62 years of life on Earth, all his memories, connections, identity, against an unknown future among the stars. The Sparks waited patiently, chirping encouragement, but making no move to force his decision. They understood the magnitude of what they were asking. A distant sound made the decision for him. The rumble of vehicles approaching down his rural road. Arthur stepped into the ship, the Sparks following eagerly. The doorway sealed seamlessly behind them. Inside, the vessel was unlike any human spacecraft. No hard angles or mechanical controls, but rather surfaces that responded to touch and thought, lighting that adjusted organically to their presence. The Sparks moved confidently to what appeared to be a control center, their ankle bands interfacing with the ship's systems. Through a transparent section of hull, Arthur watched as government vehicles pulled into his driveway, agents spilling out with flashlights and equipment. Dr. Vega emerged from the lead vehicle, directing teams toward the house and barn. The ship hummed to life, a gentle vibration Arthur felt in his bones rather than heard. The sparks chirped in what sounded like excitement as the vessel rose silently from its hiding place. Water cascaded off its hull, creating a momentary fountain in the moonlight before the pond's surface settled again. By the time the agents noticed the disturbance and turned their flashlights toward the pond, the ship had already risen high above the farm, its advanced technology rendering it nearly invisible to conventional detection. Through the view screen, Arthur watched his home shrink to a collection of distant lights, then to a point, then to nothing as the earth itself receded. A profound mixture of loss and wonder flooded through him. The sparks gathered close, their bodies warm against him, chirping in what he now recognized as reassurance. The leader touched his hand one more time, sharing a vision not of the past, but of the future, incredible worlds, breathtaking cosmic phenomena, and most importantly, a continued purpose. The bond between Arthur, the sparks, and the bees, who had been carefully relocated to special chambers within the ship, would become something entirely new. Arthur Pendleton, the failing beekeeper from Vermont, no longer existed. In his place was a traveler among the stars, caretaker of extraordinary creatures, embarking on an adventure beyond human imagination. 6 months later, astronomers across Earth reported an unusual stellar phenomenon, a new nebula suddenly visible in the night sky, its gases arranged in patterns remarkably similar to honeycomb structures. Amateur stargazers nicknamed it the Beekeeper's Nebula, unaware of how fitting the name truly was. Harold Winters, tracking the nebula from his modest observatory, noticed something no other astronomer reported: tiny points of light moving through the nebula structure, organizing the cosmic gases into increasingly complex geometric patterns. When asked about his observations by colleagues, he simply smiled and kept his theories to himself. Some truths, he knew, were better left as mysteries. In the vastness of space, Arthur tended to his ever-evolving bee colonies as the sparks. Now nearly the size of horses, their wings fully developed, taught him to navigate their vessel through the wonders of the cosmos. The honey the bees produced in zero gravity crystallized into structures of impossible complexity, containing energies that could heal, transform, or create. Arthur had left everything behind, but as he watched the sparks soar through the ship's central chamber, their scales reflecting starlight from the viewports, he knew he had gained something immeasurable in return. He had found his true purpose not in the quiet fields of Vermont, but in the infinite expanse between the stars. And occasionally, when Earth was visible as a distant blue, Arthur would raise a spoonful of starlight-infused honey in silent toast to the planet that had been his first, but not his final home.